Come and have a pew, Mum. Yes, get on the floor, get on the floor. So we are the flagship location in the Empathy Network. It's a network of communities that spans the Bay Area and Europe and Costa Rica and Kathmandu. All of them? I think that's all of them. And our greater vision is to help create, maintain and diverse a commons. So that actually takes a range of different shapes. But this is the resources that we believe should be held by the people, for the people, with free access to everyone. So all of our spaces have a kind of open door policy. We give our space out to people to use for whatever they want. And part of what this series is about making conversation available to everyone in a way that helps us work through some sort of tricky questions and really think things through. And it's really nice. I've been doing this series for about 2 years now. And what's awesome is that it now kind of runs itself. So people like Matt, who've been coming for a really long time, come and propose topics that they think are going to be useful for us to talk about. And it's really awesome. It's kind of like self-propelling. So if anyone is interested in hosting one of these, you don't have to be an expert in the field. It's just thinking about a question that you think is relevant or important to people, and like taking the time to think about some of the important questions. And the idea is that that we have a short introduction to the questions and maybe some definitions of terms, which just really helps like not waste time on definitions. And then we just have a motivated discussion about it, and it's really nice. And sometimes actions come out of that. So we've had groups, spin-off groups that have been studying money or prison systems and things like that. So sometimes, or the patriarchy salon has turned into a men's group that runs out here, so that's nice. So that's the salons. We also run a lecture series at the Red Vic, which is our sister house, on Tuesdays, which is more of a sort of formal affair, but it's fun also, so come along to those. There's a donation jar up there. We're a non-profit, so we're not taking any of this money for ourselves. Right now we are raising money to provide childcare for our events, which is really exciting to have Katie here. So Katie's the first person that's taken us up on our offer to provide childcare, and this is our way of hoping to support people for whom life becomes sort of atomized. So if you know anyone who has a kid and would like to come, we'll pay for in-house childcare, or in their home or in our home or wherever suits. So I think that's it. If anyone wants drinks, they're in the kitchen, help yourself. And bathrooms, there's a lot of bathrooms all over the place. So it's my pleasure to introduce Matt. Matt's been, oh yeah, great, yeah, wicked. Matt's been coming here for a long time, and and it's really exciting to have him come and talk about this topic. Abundance is something that we think about a lot here, because we're trying to create a different kind of life where like winning is not based on someone losing, and abundance is a sort of really big topic, and so it's really interesting to think about that critically. So I think Matt's going to talk for like 10 minutes, 15 minutes?
I'm mostly going to facilitate a conversation,
Great.
But I can tee it up a bit.
Okay, you're going to tee it up a bit. So I think there's quite a lot of us I think are going to moderate. So I have some hand signals for this. So if you have just a general point that you want to get out there at a certain point, hand up in the air. If you have a direct comment to the thing that somebody's saying right now that like feels like a direct follow-on, just point at them with 2 fingers and you get priority. C is clarification, I didn't hear you, and this is I'm upset right now. And we'll just, this is a cross, this is just like, if enough people put crosses up, we just stop for a second and calm down. I think we'll be alright today, but
I'm excited.
Sometimes they get a bit fiery, you know. So, welcome up.
So Zarina asked me to send over some topic ideas for the salon, and I sent a few things, and she said, is there any one of these that you feel most passionate about? And this was the one. I sent a little description and a title, and the title that's on the invite is different from the title that I had sent. She wasn't censoring me. She tries to frame these as a question, because these are conversations, right? The title that you guys saw was How Much is Too Much? And the original title was Fuck Abundance. You can put up the X's now. And for me, that came out of doing a lot of work trying to make the world a better place because I see a lot of pain and suffering in the world, and hey, we should make this better. And a lot of the friends that I knew who were working on that framed their work, they thought of their work as creating a world of abundance. And if abundance means not having to be completely restricted and having no freedom and all those things, yeah, that sounds great. If abundance means limitless growth, well, we also kind of know what that does. So if you have a community that figures something new out, like humans, at one point we figured out how to collaborate in ways and use some tools that allowed us to take down big mammals, right? Suddenly we could kill big mammals and our population exploded. During that period of human history, it was like, woo! It was party all the time, right? And we ended up wiping out a lot of those big mammals. And there was probably some pretty hard times after we reached that point of being able to feed in that seemingly abundant way. And for me, what this did was it helped me to shift how I thought of abundance. If abundance means, if it's driven by a desire to not feel pain, that is in part because we think of pain as a bad thing. And I think pain that is crippling or paralyzing can be pretty bad. I mean, how many of you have experienced pain and been like, this is awesome? Right? Not normally, right? We don't like pain. But I also think pain is a really, really useful thing. Pain is literally our ability to sense. If you are able to sense the world around you, then you can steer. And if you take away the ability to sense, I think you actually also take away the ability to steer. And so the worry that I have with abundance as a word and as a focus is that it focuses on the supply side as if supply is limited, rather than also recognizing, oh, well, if I have no ability to sense the impacts of my actions, if I do this, I'm fine, and if I do that, I'm fine too. If I have no ability to sense those impacts, I actually lose the ability to steer. So that's kind of to tee up what this abundance conversation is about, for me at least. And what I'm interested in exploring is, how does pain work? What pains for you are useful? How does pain help you steer in the world? What pains are not useful? At least not for you. Right? My favorite example of this is actually even when pain, like a certain pain that might be useful for you, is you eat something that's poisonous and you died. That would not be very useful for you. There wasn't a whole lot of learning that went on there. The other folks in the community, however, might go, ooh, don't eat the purple berries. Right? And so the pain that was experienced at one level, at the level of the individual, starts to become useful for a different level, the level of the community. And I'll sort of wrap up with one last thing. A lot of my work over the last few years has focused on how natural ecosystems organize themselves. And I work on information systems. I work on trying to change the structure of the internet in ways that can enable communities to self-regulate. For me, my focus, my goal is not to create an abundant world, but a world that steers better. Right? A world where we are able to navigate changing circumstances more deftly. And you might frame that as abundance. I think of it as navigation or steering. In that context, if you think about an individual and the group, that's not the only way that we can divide the world, but it's one. Oftentimes at the smaller layer, you will have growth. So you can see like deer. The deer population has a lot of food. There's a whole bunch of food that's been stored up over a long period of time. The deer find it, they eat, they have babies. Those babies eat, they have babies, and the population explodes. And then like the hunters that we were talking about earlier, with the big mammals, they run out of that food. And there's a big collapse. And so harmony or abundance at one layer, at the layer of the deer population, ends up collapsing the larger ecosystem. So harmony at one layer can create discord at an adjacent layer. But for me, the interesting thing came when I realized, oh, you can flip that on its head. You can have discord at one layer, the ability to sense when something goes wrong, helping you create harmony at a larger layer. This is how we normally learn. This is how we navigate the world. We try things a little bit, put a toe in the water. I don't jump in first. Like, oh, that's cold, right? And so with little tiny steps, we're able to take on pain and try things in ways that don't sort of kill us. And those help us to know when to take a bigger step, when not to. So for me, the lesson that I drew from that was, if abundance is about turning away from pain altogether, I think there's another path that you can take. It's not to flee pain, it's to actually seek out pain, but in small enough sizes that you can take it on, you can bear it when things go wrong, and it can help you steer better. So that's kind of the teeing it up part. I hope I've triggered some people here. So I'd like to hear some thoughts from you guys.
Yeah. I kind of just like, I'm quibbling a little bit with the opposites you draw between abundance and pain. It's specifically the pain of not having, right? But there are other forms of pain. There's pain of having too much, like, I don't know, kind of like how Frank Ocean or Drake might express it. But like, that's right. So it's just like, why only specifically the pain of not having too much, or do you really think that like abundance can be taken as the opposite of pain?
I was coming at it from a particular context of people who are trying to change the world in ways that solve pain
by abundance. Right?
And they were looking for abundance to be the solution to that pain. And my problem was, I was seeing that answer and going, yeah, but that just leads to another collapse, right? It leads you to grow until you get to this point, and then you're facing the problem again. When there's another tool in the tool chest, which is recognizing, oh, wait a minute, the issue with that is it leads to what I call bloom and bust. Right? So you grow to the size of the resources available, and then you alter the ecosystem, and your very success changes your circumstances and creates a collapse. And there's usefulness to that. I won't go into what the usefulness of that cycle is, but the cost is lots of pain and suffering. Another alternative approach is, if you can sense that that's coming and can change your behavior earlier, maybe you don't have as many babies, you don't have to go through that same, we grew beyond the bounds, broke everything, and now we're death-tied. Come back. Yeah.
So abundance, the opposite of abundance, I guess I would call it scarcity, right? Like scarcity is when you don't have something. So do you think that is there such a thing as achieved abundance, or will we just get increasingly creative at inventing scarcity? So like all of us here have homes, food, these kinds of things, which would be previously scarce, now they're not scarce. And yet all of us here want, prestige, friends, these kinds of things. So we just come up with new things that we want, right?
All of us want
these kinds of things.
Friends.
So we just come up with new things that we want, right? And then we want human connections, etc. So is the search for abundance really just coming up with increasingly interesting scarcities?
Can I throw that to other folks?
Okay. I mean,
would you like me to answer that, or is it okay?
Of course, definitely open it up. And if that is the case, then doesn't that sound like kind of a nice thing?
What thing?
A nice thing? If it is just coming up with increasingly interesting scarcities, isn't that okay and not, self-destructive?
have you got responses to this? Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, was that two fingers?
Two fingers.
Okay, next time. Yeah, I think that to some level, abundance and scarcity they can be measured relativistically, in terms of like everyone is wealthy in San Francisco, even the poor people, in a relativistic sense. But in an absolute sense, like people are even wealthier relative to the rest of the planet. But it's much more commonly viewed, your abundance and your scarcity is much more commonly viewed in the lens of your community and your network and your surroundings. And so I think there is something to be said for abundance is a frame of mind, a frame of reference. And there's some absolute things in which you like definitely need food and shelter and human connection, and then you do invent like additional things to find abundance in. And I think that to some level is like a search for pain. I think that people keep yearning and keep growing, and I think there's something fundamental about like a driven person that they do continue to find ways to like integrate like a pain, a feeling of being without something, and that eventually gets to be these very abstract concepts or these very specific toys or things they want. Like if I just had one more of these things, or if I had this specific thing, or if I had like the respect of this micro community of people that were, you know, evolutionary biologists, then I would be happy, you know. And like at first you just want friends, and then you really want to like be recognized, and then you want a Nobel, and like that is a form of pain. That's like a form of search for like through growth, through pain.
Oh, so where I was going to take a step back and actually kind of address.
I have a direct
Yeah, so if you have a direct.
actually, if you and then we'll. So actually, I think it's important to distinguish between things we need to stay alive and things we just kind of fancy. And I think, you know, there is a lot of desire creation in the world, and we can talk about that another time. But like, if we're focusing on things that we need to stay alive,
It died.
okay. You know, like. I'm not sure that abundance necessarily has to mean ultimate and unregulated growth. You know, like I think actually it could just be better distribution, and that could create. I mean, we definitely have like more cereal than we need, right? And we could just distribute that better and provide something that can keep other people alive. And I think that it's important to distinguish that slightly from the sort of desire creation that we experience sort of on top of these basic sort of human needs.
Well, and I guess I would just say that, you know, it depends on where. Short-term abundance is not, you know, quite the same. You know, your example of the deer, right? So that was a short-term abundance. Whereas if you're looking at something, and it depends on like kind of what scale you're talking about, but if you're looking at a homeostasis more, you know, where there is abundance that is created through like this kind of known state, where people, animals, etc., are working in a sort of harmonious fashion. And I guess, you know, something that everybody in this room is probably pretty familiar with is kind of like the fairy tale of technology, like that's going to solve all these problems. And to a great extent it has. You know, we don't have to each own a copy of the encyclopedia because we have Wikipedia. You know, so that saves a lot of paper and wasted effort and shipping costs and what have you. And there are certainly things along those lines that provide increased abundance for folks. But is what you're getting at like kind of a redefinition of the concept? Is like, are we talking about the wrong thing when we're trying to do good in the world, or what is your sense of that?
Yeah, I think my part of why I take issue with the word is that I think it's the place where you just took the conversation. I don't think is inherent in how people normally think about that word. Like you just took the conversation to complex systems at various scales and the ways in which those interoperate, right? And how something at this level affects things at this level, which also affects things over here, and that has a feedback mechanism. And I don't think things are ever homeostatic. I don't think it's ever a process that just runs in an infinite loop. I think those things are always fed by something external. Any flow in any system is basically an eddy with something that's going past that's generating that eddy, right? So it could be light, right? The sun goes away. Hey, guess what? All these amazing like layers of animals and plants and interacting systems, like sun goes away, they still exist, but they're corpses, you know, or many of them are, right? There are some that maybe don't need light and will persist for a while. But the ones that are light dependent, they're corpses, and they no longer are thriving. There is no more vitality there. And I think that when we see things that are static, and actually I'm borrowing this from a guy named Paul Kraffel, who wrote a wonderful book called Seeing Nature. When we see things that appear to be still, they don't seem to be changing, that usually means there's something else that's very stable, that's not shifting, and we aren't able to see the flow that's going on there. There's another layer of stuff flowing through that we're not even observing, but you tilt that balance a little bit, and all of a sudden this very stable thing just drains away, right? Or it explodes in ways that disrupt the other things around it. So that's kind of why I come at this stuff from that place. The other thing that brought me here is I was a political theorist, so I was trying to figure out, like, how do you actually make decisions and structure systems in ways that work for communities to use in practice. And the distinction between what is the bare minimum for survival and what is nice to have, there is no clean line there, right? That is something that happens from a particular perspective. In 1992, what was needed for survival in some parts of the U.S. included a television, right? And that wasn't true 100 years ago, and it's probably not true now. Like, how many of you have televisions in your home? Right? Like, some of us, but it's not the bulk anymore. Why? Because we're using other screens now, and we have other forms of communication. And yeah.
Are you telling me that somebody at some point has claimed that you needed a television to stay alive?
They didn't claim that you needed it to stay alive, but it became something that was sort of perceived as, like, that's the standard basket of goods that people should have. Not television necessarily, but making it or trying to. But because there is no tablet in the sky that we can all turn to for where to draw that line, we end up having to fall back on things like this discussion about abundance to help us figure out, like, how do we do this?
Yes, Sean.
So I think a lot about some of the innate evolved desires and urges and feelings that we have about things, and there's this kind of split between the response that most of the animal kingdom has to its environment, where the resources that they rely on are rival goods. So if I eat the food, you can't. If I get to reproduce with this mate, then you can't, and so on. And it's only kind of recently that in our evolutionary history that we added a different mechanism, which was social cooperation, to exploit goods that are not necessarily rival. So of course the megafauna initially looked like things that we could cooperatively gain mutually from, but then we exterminated them. So that didn't play for very long. But I kind of want to claim that there are other things like just the pleasure of sharing and kind of enjoying company is kind of one of those non-rival goods that increases by us all enjoying it. And possession of skill, so if I have more skill, then I can do things that make other people happy. That's also one of those things that everyone can all benefit from. And so I kind of want to point out that a lot of discussions, particularly in economics and the capitalist world, have to do with money, which really is about kind of power, or the power and social status that money buys, which of course is a harshly rival good, and it makes us all think that the world is all like that. But in fact, there's this other world, and maybe the whole question of abundance can be turned on its head in this other world, if we can just enter it.
We've got several people with
Two fingers. 1, 2, 3.
So yeah, I was thinking about the same thing from just an evolutionary perspective. We are here because we seek. We're here because we're curious, and exploring our world is how we've grown and evolved and are alive today. And so it's so fundamental to our nature that, of course, when we collectively scale Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a species, that same impetus for more is going to move beyond our basic resources and move toward things higher up on the hierarchy, like, love and connection and intellectual stimulation. That's why I showed up tonight, right? But I don't know that I would say it's inherently a bad thing. I would say avoidance of pain is a bad thing, but curiosity is like my fuel, I want to live in a state of constant curiosity. I think maybe making a distinction between these things would be useful, because if we're saying that abundance means not seeking, I don't like that. But if we're saying like wanting abundance for the sake of abundance and living in a state of always needing more and not being in touch with your like internal wholeness that you can tap into at any time through, you know, meditation or whatever you may have. I think those are really important for me to separate, because being curious and seeking growth and connection is like why I'm alive, you know. So yeah, I think that distinction's important.
Do you have one, Charles?
Oh, sorry, I just have a separate.
Okay. You go.
So in regards to the animals and us being different in that regard, so we have goods that are non-zero sum, right? But do we treat them as such? For instance, we have the good of living in San Francisco, and then everybody comes to do it, you know, the classic story, and then the rent goes up. Or how much are Burning Man tickets, right? Like, especially on the, you know, aftermarket. So even though we have goods that are not physically limited by anything, do we maybe still have this animal, if you will, tendency to turn them into scarcity? So like, oh, these people know where it's at. This is the cool bar. Now we all want to go there, you know? Restaurant line in San Francisco as well. So maybe we are still animals in that sense. We create these abundant goods and then we somehow turn them into limited factors. Or maybe there was one.
Like diamonds.
Yes, and I have a quick response to that, which is grading on a curve. Like a classroom where everyone could potentially acquire skill, and then you're going to grade on a curve so that you're going to tell some students that they're terrible and bad and bad learners. Like, great example of that.
Anyone else have a
Did you have two fingers? I can't tell.
I did. Sorry, yes I did.
Yeah, go.
That's what Hila had said, which is just to say that, like, in some ways the problem of like material abundance is like not that interesting, from the standpoint that like it's actually relatively easy to achieve it. I think we have certain technical solutions for this. There's some constraints we have to place on our population, what have you, if we're thinking about the planet as like the bounding apparatus there. But as far as what I appreciate about what Hila said is that like once we get beyond just those kind of relatively base needs, like the idea of abundance and growth comes from these other sorts of endeavors, a lot of them looking inward or about connecting with others. Those things are free, and although there may be actually significant pain in terms of trying to achieve them, they're there for anybody, at the level at which they want to kind of like take those kinds of projects on. And so, in that sense, it's like maybe abundance is sort of a limiting phrase, or that it needs to be kind of divided into some sort of like very base materialistic sort of like everybody has what they need to like, they have food, shelter, like, maybe like basic social connection, but like beyond that, like there's so many more deeper and interesting places you can go, and maybe you need a smartphone to do that, because that might be
food, shelter, smartphone.
Yeah, exactly.
Connection. Right, that's becoming.
Actually, kind of dovetailing off of that, I think there's so much that that just turns on the availability to like think about any sort of abundance other than your basic needs, just turns on having all of those needs met. And I think it's obvious that like all of the stuff we consume, especially in the United States, like so many externalities go into that. There's so many costs to these various systems, and like you touched upon, there's so many things like pumping into that system that seems so closed to us. Like, oh, I just go to the store, go online and buy something, it just shows up, I don't know. But beyond that, all of like our chance to do this, to be communal, like is also built upon all that abundance, all those basic needs like casually being met. And it does sort of map roughly to like Maslow's hierarchy. Which, by the way, Burning Man tickets, if anyone has any, I would take them. Starting a camp called House of Maslow. Just throwing it out there. Yeah. So, but I think it's called House of Maslow. So I think there's like so much that we can take for granted, but so much that is not obvious to us. And I think that like even seeking out those higher levels of like community and curiosity, there's a lot of pain that's caused by that, like by spending so much time doing that. And like I think I'm reminded of like the option to live minimally is like something that's very privileged. Like most people just call that having nothing. Like when you're wealthy, you call it like living with less. Like that's a very, very privileged choice to be able to make.
Do any two fingers is going up?
Over here.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was sorry, I hate reading off my phone, but to that point, there's this thing someone posted today, things the world's most and least privileged people say. I don't have a TV, I never eat meat, I walk 10 miles a day, my diet is making me lose a lot of weight, I use my own waste to grow food, my children aren't vaccinated, I have a very small carbon footprint, I don't vote, the system is too corrupt. And I was like, that's exactly like the point that you made. The most privileged and the least privileged share a lot, and it's almost like once you have all your basic needs met, you're actually seeking the simplicity of the people that don't have their basic needs met, which I think is kind of shocking, interesting.
Yeah.
I noticed that when I moved here a number of years ago, and I started, I'm from California, but I actually was in medical school in New York, and then I came to train at San Francisco General Hospital, which still had psychiatric beds, which is an issue. But I just remember that like the fashions kind of shifted, and all of a sudden, over a couple of years, a couple things happened, and I'm going to date myself a little here. I couldn't tell who was psychotic and who was talking on a phone because phones emerged, and I was like if I heard somebody really talking really loud in a really kind of pressured way, that was a psychiatric symptom. Whereas now if I hear someone, I'm always looking for the device rather than thinking that it's a symptom. And the other thing I noticed is, and for some reason I thought of this, the fashions started to get almost mentally ill looking. Like I would go to work and people would have these like really shuffly outfits on and really old glasses from the 70s, and then you go out and people have really expensive shuffly outfits on and glasses from the 70s, and I sort of wondered like, and I've always wanted to have this conversation like, how come the culture, just with the fashion piece, is reflecting what maybe people with like very untreated schizophrenia and bipolar are doing? It's really quite fascinating.
Okay, you go.
Yeah, so I came from a country, so I came from China. When I was born, there's a policy talking about only one-child policy. And the assumption is based on, the resource is limited and we will be overpopulation, so everyone should only have one child instead of as many as we want. And then still there are lots of people can find their way to get around. And then when I came here, it's the opposite. Like you can buy so many things, there are tons of promotion. So I start to form a sense of the so-called scarcity or abundance. It's actually an illusion that is created by the system we are in. Meaning, when I was in China, the government want people to do certain things, so they create, like with media or many propaganda, they try to create that sense of scarcity so that everyone can go to do whatever they want us to do. And here, the government or the business want us to buy lots of things. Like we want to keep the economy running, so we think, we have tons of stuff. So I think it's always depending on how the system want us to do, and if we are aware of that, how we can think beyond the ecosystem we are in. And the second point I want to make is about greediness. I think like the opposite of abundance is not scarcity, is how greedy you are. Like that's my point of view.
Just quickly on that, I think the evolutionary need for like community and all these higher level things are I think in abstract very, very strong. But I think the issue that we've run into through the Industrial Revolution, and it keeps on getting ratcheted up, is that it's so much more profitable and so much easier to scale like created demand, like artificial demand for things. Like it's just so much easier to create demand for like breakfast cereals than it is to create demand for community. Like you just can't make as much money connecting people. Facebook might be a counterexample, but only because you're being advertised to, like you are the product. But like they're the only people to like, in a sense, really make money off of building community or communication. And I think that has like a breathtaking number of consequences. That like it's just easier and quicker to scale up certain types of demand for things and needs.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've got lots of hands. Yeah, go. Yeah, one,
really
two, three,
quickly.
four.
So just to respond to that, I think you're absolutely right. Like we financialize like so many aspects of our existence, to the point where you don't have to rely on the community actually because you can pay for it, and because we live in this like affluent from a monetary standpoint society, you are able to pay for those things. But actually, even like it's like the earlier levels of Maslow's hierarchy, you actually got a lot of that community stuff like for free. It was like a byproduct of the fact that you had to rely on others to fulfill your needs. And so we actually kind of, I think, have a greater dearth of that now than maybe in the past when there was, less material or less material wealth, because you didn't really have a choice. You had to rely on your most immediate neighbors to get that, and you got all these other things as a great byproduct of it.
We've got two fingers at the back. Do you have two fingers? No? No? No, okay. Good.
Well, and to add, I think it's a great point that where's the abundance that's being created now? There's a bunch of free products. What's the cost? Our privacy, our information. And then the new abundance, I think, within the economy of possibly shifting and jobs getting lost is looking for errors and exploiting weaknesses in a scaling up system, which creates a massive drag, I think, on everybody psychically. The identity theft, the ways in which, these huge industries develop around exploiting ignorance or loopholes that people can't anticipate. And then it's not just that we're in an absence of each other, but we are literally kind of banging through the red tape with our free products.
So to bring the point of population again, when I think about how much is too much, I think about the exponential growth in population and our aging population, specifically in something like East Asian countries like Korea, Singapore. You have an aging population and not enough young people. The birth rate is somewhere like 1.1, 1.2. So in a few decades, there will literally not be enough workforce to support this aging population. And there are a couple of different frameworks to look at this. If you're a superpower, if you're a nation, you want more people. You want your population to grow. You have more influence, you have more buying power as a nation. But if you're an environmentalist, you're outgrowing your land. In Korea, for example, there's not enough, I'm thinking the opposite of arid. Arable. Thank you, guys. There's not enough arable land, so they literally can't support their population, so they have to buy products from others. So if you're an environmentalist, you say, this is too much, I can't support this. If you're the nation, if you're the government, you say, this is great, we have a growing population. So I'm constantly thinking about if we're trying to be abundant through these different frameworks, and if I'm using the framework that you provided, if we're trying to avoid pain, avoid scarcity, we're trying to avoid death.
Yeah.
So if we're trying to, say, be 100 years old, how much is too much? How much is too old? When do we start being, depleting our resources? When do we start becoming a burden on society, on Social Security, etc.? So these are a couple of questions that I'm thinking about.
So I've got two independent questions. I need two fingers. Okay, I'm going to go for you because you've been waiting for a bit, and then I'll come back.
So two things. The first one is around this question of like bare necessity versus everything else. I feel like the edge between these two, it's not just that like the edge is a little bit fuzzy. It's like it's really actually hard to figure out, or like there's no good answer for it, because things like a smartphone, like even at a very low level of income now, are a real barrier if you don't have it. Or things like how much healthcare is like enough at the right level. So that's the first point I wanted to make. And the second point I want to make is around like the moral component of the initial question. So there's a strong moral component to it. It's like basically, if abundance is not desirable, what is? And so I'm trying to think of like three different ways that you could pose that question. The first one is, given my position in the system, once you start this idea of like abstracting from the system and thinking what's better, like at a higher level, what can I do with my position, with the 2% I can influence, or the 0.5% I can influence? That's one way of asking the question. Second one is, what should we as humanity desire as a whole? And the third one becomes a bit more abstract. It becomes more of like, once you think about things as a system, the like power, the place of free will, or the place of like individual action kind of falls apart, and it becomes more about like accepting the world as it is and accepting that long periods of prosperity and abundance now means that a lot of people are going to suffer in the long run. So which one of these, or where does the initial question come for you?
Sure. Before I dive into that, I just want to say thank you. There were so many good points. Like I have like 12 things I would love to just spew, right? But I'm not going to do that because it would kind of ruin the conversational flow. But I do want to point out some highlights. I really loved this. I really loved the point that you made, and I will try to incorporate some of that into this answer. I was traumatized as a child by having lived all over the world. I was an army brat. I lived in Europe, I lived in Asia, I lived in the US, and I got to see a lot of pain and suffering, and a lot of, hey, the world doesn't work well. And so by the time I was an adult, I was like, we don't have a functional global regulatory system. We go to war regularly, we're killing all the species. Nobody decided, yeah, let's go do that. We didn't all take a vote, right? Those are side effects of how our system functions, right? Those are side effects of the way that our regulatory systems operate, and we have many of them, but they work in conjunction with one another. One of them is money, right, and how markets work. Another is government and voting and prisons and courts and making laws and all that stuff. Those are regulatory systems that interoperate in ways that have impacts, right? There are some dysfunctionalities there. In the middle of law school, I had a bit of a realization about how communities that are really small regulate themselves in a particular way, and it was some of this connection, community, we care what other people think, etc., all that kind of stuff, and I went, oh, okay, I get it. That reputation-based stuff, that relationship, not just reputation is about the sending of that information, that history, but the relationship-based way that a small community regulates itself, we were never able to scale that, right? And so we started relying on different regulatory systems. We literally invented new forms of regulation that allowed us to thrive in bigger group sizes, in nation sizes, and things like that. And those new forms relied on a tool that we'd always had and we'd always used, but it wasn't at the center of our regulation. And that tool was violence. Right? When we think about regulation today, we normally think about government as the thing that does the regulating, and violence, etc. And the issue with violence is that it actually forces agreement. The violent act itself it locates on the body of the individual who has done the bad thing, right? And so it forces the entire community into making a determination about whether what they did was good or bad and how good or bad it was. Was it bad enough to kill them? Was it bad enough to put them in jail for a year or 3 months or a day? Right? The relationship and reputation stuff works differently. One person decides that what you did is bad. Somebody else decides that what you did is okay. Somebody else decides that what you did is great, and they're willing to date you because of it, right? And because of that, the relationship-based regulatory system, which I call access control, the enforcing act lands on the resource or the individual that you are gaining or losing access to. For me, the place that I got driven to, what I realized was, the internet is allowing us to do reputation at scale. But the way that it works currently is eBay-like or Airbnb-like. There's a one-size-fits-all rating system. And it works in those contexts, but it works because everybody in that community kind of agrees about what counts as good behavior. In the general world, we're never going to agree about what counts as good behavior. So I got interested in how do you change the structure of the internet in ways that enable us to do reputation-type regulation without having to agree about who to trust, what's important, what's appropriate, how important it is, etc. This actually dives back into the point that you made and the point that you made about the structure of the system and the way that we do a lot of this independent decision making today. We use that a lot, right? We call it the market. But it's mediated, those exchanges, there's one type of signal that gets communicated really well across that system, and that's price. Price communicates across a complex supply chain incredibly well. Price of copper goes up, price of things that use copper go up. Price of services that make use of things that use copper go up. And the guy at the end of the line doesn't have to know anything about that, but he can see that this one is cheaper than that one. right? He doesn't know why it's cheaper, but he sees it's cheaper. And so it drives demand, it drives activity toward cheaper routes. That's the invisible hand, right? That's how the invisible hand works. It's just that price composes across the supply chain. The problem is that other forms of information don't communicate as well. They don't compose as well. Why is it cheaper? Is it cheaper because they invented some incredible new system for making this thing? Or is it cheaper because they don't treat their pollution? Or because they're using slaves? That information doesn't get communicated across the system, so we aren't able to do a distributed regulation of our system. We've supplemented that, we've subsidized that for a really long time by using violence, the government thing, to set floors. We'll set a floor on how much you have to pay people. We'll set a floor on how well you have to treat your pollution before you dump it. We'll set a floor on et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? And there are regulatory problems with the deciding of where to set those floors. So I work with a group called the Meta-Currency Project to build these kinds of systems, but we think of currencies differently. We don't think of currency as just money. Currencies are signals. And I'm going to loop all of that back to the answer to your question. So I got interested in this stuff because I wanted to know how we could regulate our world in a more healthy way. But a lot of it led me to studying natural systems. How do natural ecosystems regulate themselves? And the reason I went there was not because I'm a hippie. It's because billions of years of things being tried, the stuff that's on the ground works. It works not only in the short term, it works in the long term, right? It works at various stages of locality and generality, et cetera, et cetera. And I sort of mapped out some basically an organizing pattern that nature uses. I don't know your name, the gentleman who's in the maroon. Sean. The point that you made earlier about rival versus non-rival goods. You had said that it is a good point. I don't want to take that away from it. But it underestimated the amount of collaboration that happens in natural ecosystems. You will have an animal or whatever that sees a plant and it eats it, and another animal doesn't get a hold of that, right? But in general, what you actually see emerging over the longer term is, if you zoom out, you see that each animal and each plant is useful to all the others around it in that it transforms resources in some way. Those resources flow through it, they get transformed in some way that are beneficial to others. Why? Because by if I do something that's useful to him, and then he does something that's useful for him, and he does something that's useful for her, and she does something that's useful for me, we can do a better job of surviving in this environment than other creatures that are here. And so collaborations get favored, for the same reason why specialization in our community gets favored, right? And so, yes, there is a rivalry to that, but the ones that win tend to be the collaborators. Right? They have a collaborative advantage. There's a pretty simple math there. So that's like a big spew, right? So hopefully that answers the question adequately.
Okay, I've got two hands up here. I'll do you first and then you.
Specifically about your argument about natural systems being good, you probably know way more about natural systems.
Useful.
Yeah, useful. Yeah. Because you say that natural systems has done well for so long generally is if you lump every single species together and right? But there's species who are not around anymore and they didn't win the lottery, right? Does this factor into your studying of natural systems as for?
Yeah. The super short version, which hopefully touches on the point that you had made earlier as well. Evolution has two parts, generative and curative, right? Generative, hey, we had babies. There were lots of babies. Those babies are a little bit different, each one of them, right? Curative, it got cold. The skinny ones died. Right? If you're thinking about a strategy, that's a really useful strategy for making sure that something made it through. The ability to do that, I mentioned earlier, that bloom and bust cycle, well, the usefulness of the bloom is the diversity that you get. So that when circumstances change or something comes along, something makes it through. Some member of your population is more likely to make it through. Does that happen? Yeah, it happens. It's actually how nature learns, right? There's a lot of dead ends. I don't want to I don't want to act as if what I'm saying here is nature and the nature's organizing pattern is good. That's a moral judgment that there's a lot of things about how nature operates that we don't like and don't want to incorporate into how we regulate our world, right? For me, the reason I talk about the pain stuff is I actually think if you can do a better job of sensing small pains at the higher levels of like, hey, people dying and things like that, we can do a better job of not having it, or of not having those people in the first place. Not because the government said we shouldn't, but because we started making decisions of like, we invented contraception. We don't have to, right? Our bodies are built in ways that trick us into having children, right? It's totally true. I didn't come up with this. I think Louis C.K. has a bit about it, okay? Our bodies trick us into having children. Oh, I really want, and what your body's really doing is, I really want a baby, right? It's not I want to have sex, it's I want to, that's how we think about it. Contraception allowed us to have sex and not have babies, and suddenly we were able to decide, how many babies do I want, right? So I think we will solve that stuff through cultural stuff, and some of it has to do with being able to sense the impact, right? Hey, if I have a baby, what does that really mean for that baby, for the world as a whole? And we will make our own decisions about, and there may be governments trying to force us on this stuff too, but we will, in my world, ideally make our own decisions about, do I want that? Is that going to work out well for me, for them, etc.? Does that answer the question?
I feel like we were talking about different types of pain, and I keep getting confused because I feel like we talked about individual pain. So if you lack abundance or you lack resources, you have a pain. But then you're talking about the ability to sense pain, and I feel like that's more sensing other people's pain in the decisions you make. And so then now I'm trying to tie in like the nature analogy into it, and I'm a little confused. I forgot what my point is.
So there's a term that I use. I don't know if I came up with it or not, but I use it a fair bit, called coherence layers. And the thing this is really about is, hey, the world seems like it's made of things that are separate, right? But there's actually flows that go into and out of things. So I eat and I poop. Turns out everything eats and poops. And so when you talk about an individual, we normally think about humans as if they are separate from the world around them. I am Matt, right? I have an identity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But just like everything else in the world, I've got subparts, and each of those are an individual, and a larger community has parts. The jumping across coherence layers, the larger community stuff, if it only affects the community, and it doesn't, there's no way for you to sense it or feel it, you will not be sensitive to it. But if going and buying something that uses slaves in Malaysia, you're like, I don't care about slaves. But if suddenly your customers are no longer willing to buy from you because you relied on that, you do become sensitive to it. Because that makes it impact you. It's a way of it doesn't force you to do that. But if the folks around you feel like they don't want to support that thing or that action, and you've taken that action, it's a mechanism for enabling distributed decision-making basically to happen in local ways. You still have the choice to go, well, I don't care about those people. I'll do business with these people over here. But that's kind of why I am jumping across layers. I do think it always comes back to the individual and what that individual is capable of sensing, which is why I focus on building systems to help individuals sense and make sense of the world. I think those individuals are going to have to rely on others, right, in massive ways to help them make sense of the world. I also think those individuals should be able to steer who they're relying upon. They should be the ones in charge. So,
okay. I've got one here, and then you. I want to wait. You can wait for a while.
Well, I think this is a fascinating conversation. One thing that kind of like strikes me is that I think there's a lot of people in this room. I mean, all of us, myself included, that are probably in a similar situation. I feel like there's maybe like a little bit of a monoculture in San Francisco. Like we're all here on a Thursday night because we have, because we can afford to be here and kind of like have these intellectual conversations. And we talk about abundance, and I think just like the fact that we're asking this question, like, right, how much is too much, probably comes from like a sense of privilege. And I think it was interesting when you brought up China, like we talk about global warming and like carbon emissions and whatnot. A lot of the countries that are less developed, like China or India, one of their arguments is that, well, the Western world is already developed, and now they're kind of like they're limiting our ability to kind of catch up by implementing these strict environmental standards because they've now seen the light, right? Because they can afford to kind of make that decision now. And so sometimes, I wonder, like a lot of, I think this is a very much of a microcosm here in San Francisco, and when I look at some of the products or services that have come out of this area in the last 20, 30 years, while we think of them as very like democratizing or very universal, they're actually they're very monotone. Like, email looks the same as it does here as it does in China. Facebook, the product Facebook people in China use it the same way as they do here or in Europe or whatnot. It's not really localized. So I think a lot of us sometimes when we think about like, oh, we want to understand the world, but I think in reality we are maybe a little bit of an echo chamber. And again, like this is a perfect example, right? We're sitting in this room talking about it. But I'm curious if anyone here has an opinion about how to actually like break through, if they perceive this as a problem, A, and then B, how they think that we can actually break through and figure out what other people truly want, as opposed to us like trying to, project our opinions or desires onto them.
Yeah. Do you have this? Are you commenting?
Yeah.
No. Yeah. What? Hang on. Is this a direct comment or are you just?
Oh, I just raised my hand.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Yeah. So thinking back to coherence layers, we can think of this from a systems perspective, or we can think of it on an individual perspective. So maybe instead of imposing these externalized structures on other people, what we can really do is figure out on an individual level how can we structure ourselves that can affect everything at scale, right? So I think if we're thinking about abundance and the avoidance of pain, on an individual level, I've heard people, like after you go through something traumatic or relationship-wise, or people are always like, oh, like there's so many fish in the sea, like it's okay, and it's like almost this mental heuristic to skip the pain. But right, if you slow it down and you stay present with just yourself and experience in the moment like, oh, maybe it's not something external that I need in order to feel this sense of completeness, and on an individual level we train ourselves to learn that we can satisfy ourselves, maybe not from, as we're making this distinction between like physical resources, but at least like emotionally and intellectually there are ways we can stimulate ourselves. I think that can permeate culture in a really profound way, and I think I have seen that in San Francisco actually, because there's so many people who I do think take the time to learn about how to create internal abundance so that externally they're not trying to change the world around them in order to feel whole. I think that type of culture at scale can affect lots of people, and it's something that every individual has the power to curate.
But just so, I guess maybe to go back, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but let's say like the first year intro, right? You were like, if you feel uncomfortable, you make that sign. And so I think there's a lot of, again, not putting you on the spot, but I think that's a very San Francisco thing to do. I think a lot of people are like, oh, pain, I don't want to like cause pain to others, or it's almost like this friction is something that we try to avoid with such like, fervor, and I'm just, I don't know, like sometimes I'm trying to think like, what is really the genesis of that, and if that's really beneficial, like even psychologically to kind of approach it from that standpoint.
Yeah. So I'm just going to comment on that. So actually this is for facilitating the conversation, because actually the whole thing just falls apart when people their hands start to shake, and I personally think that like in many situations you should seek out your pain. Your pain is usually information that there is a mismatch between your internal beliefs about the world and the reality, and it's usually worth going to explore. And I think it's really important to distinguish that from access to water. Right? And I think this is sort of what I'm coming back to, this sort of conversation about like, well, we shouldn't project what other people need, or Why is it that when we suddenly have abundance, we start to look like people who don't have abundance? And the fundamental difference is that this is about choice and opportunity. So we have the opportunity to choose a I could say, well, I have so much cereal that I decided I'm going to go on a fast and I'm going to eat Brussels sprouts, and like that may look like imposed scarcity, but it is a choice. And I think it's really important that we distinguish between these chosen scarcities. I think sex is another great example where the majority of people feel that they're in some sort of like state of social isolation or physical isolation or sexual isolation, and this is many times self-imposed. And I think that's really important for us to distinguish between, so what's happening?
It died.
Okay, sorry, yeah, it's not fine enough. 2 fingers.
I just think about it was like, how do we figure out what to give people, like what people need and give to them? I have some tangible examples from that, like based in San Francisco. So I have a lot of friends that are working on homelessness in San Francisco, and that's like something I think we all witness and experience every single day, and hopefully none of us like enjoy witnessing it, like we're at a loss of what to offer them. So there's this one group, and I'm forgetting the name, but it was a group of designers that went out and they were like just handing out supplies, to the homeless on Monday nights or something, and they were like standard like canned goods, stuff that you think they would need, and then they were like, we want condoms, and like they weren't even asking for booze, they were like, we want condoms, we want like really simple hygiene products, because we want to feel clean and important, and we want to be able to engage in sex, it's a biological drive. And so they literally carry on backpacks, and they give them what they need because they talk to them, they like did user interviews basically, and I was like, that's brilliant. And then another example was, talk to people, right?
Revolutionary.
We suffer because we're so over-educated in this town, we're like, let's solve it with technology because we're all engineers and designers, we're like, let's solve it with like a spaceship. But really, just talk to people and give them condoms. And the other one was, we were talking a lot about like, as you ascend Maslow's hierarchy of needs, sorry, I sound a little crass, I don't mean it that way. Communication, or like community rather, becomes scarcity because we have less reliance upon each other. But even the homeless were saying, like my friends were going around asking us, what can we do? We don't want to be walking ATM machines and give you $1 because we feel bad for you. And they're like, we don't even want the dollar, we just want eye contact. We want confirmation that we exist, we want acknowledgement. And so my friend was like, yeah, we want to make a homeless person feel better, or like make the world a better place. Stare into their eyes and like acknowledge them and say, just like give them attention and don't just ignore them. And I was like, that's brilliant too. That's so simple, and it's like ask them what they need, give it to them, and it doesn't really cost anything. So that was my 2 cents.
I love what you said.
Yeah.
I feel like it pierced a kind of veneer of something. And I'll just say, as a psychiatrist, really make sure they want to be stared at in the eyes, because some people are going to find that an attack. That's just a pro tip. I feel like, working with that population or working with other populations, and maybe, I was here sort of as the tech boom was ramping up, and then I'll read, what we're going to be doing. We're going to be having driverless cars, and we're going to have this, and we're going to have that, and I'll think, that sounds like a Jetsons episode I never wanted to live in. And that's being offered / forced as the new future that wasn't really asked about. I would actually like to live in a future where nobody feels degraded. That would be my choice over driverless cars, or I would like them to be, I would like to be asked, I would like to contribute, I'd actually like it to fall much more into an ecosystem model, I'd like it to be a closed loop system, I'd like it to be a triple bottom line. And so what I struggle with as the privilege increases and increases and increases, and Zuckerberg gives $75 million to San Francisco General Hospital, but the psychiatric beds remain closed. It's only for the illnesses that are pretty or cute or the people who deserve it. I'm not making fun of kids or trauma victims, but it's just easier for people to think about than the chronically mentally ill homeless people walking around. So, I would like to know, or maybe you have an idea, really, how do we actually value voices of people who aren't running the platforms. It's actually like the people who are coding, the people who are doing the platforms. And I gotta be honest, my colleagues and I are talking, like, we're seeing these people in treatment, like, they're not doing great personally. Like, a lot of them are really struggling emotionally. The people who are like coding and making our future of tomorrow. And sometimes I work with kids, I think, you know, are we really like, are we making platforms that are like exacerbating childhood symptoms, you know, like suicidality or depression or anxiety, because maybe I guess you're going to Hila's point, like, are we baking in systems into this future that like really think about what we need, or is the abundance much more of a want than a need?
Yeah,
there's just kind of 2 points, and it's kind of related to what you were saying about natural systems, and I guess I'm curious about how we make decisions in an ecosystem-based model, or how we make decisions at all related to that, just because, like you were saying, there's these kind of invisible flows that we don't understand the complexity of them, so how do we then make a decision about, you know, how many kids to have, or what's the right level for the planet, or, you know, we have really no idea about, like, how can we sense the pain or the impact that any of our actions will have if we're taking that. I mean, we should be taking a long view, right? But how do we understand the impact that our actions will have? I'm curious. You said you're studying this, right? And trying to figure out how that works. I'm kind of curious as to.
I'll answer that. You had 2 points then.
Okay.
What was your second one?
No, I was just saying it was related to these two.
Okay, got it. Okay. This is why pain is so important, from my perspective. In order to be able to make decisions in a world that is that complex, you're going to have to rely on others to steer you. And you don't want to just know about the thing at the end. Like, did they use slaves? You want to know about the guides along the way. And so there's reputation for individuals and for this algorithm and for whatever, right? And when something proves not useful in some way, it's important for people to be able to signal to others, like, that didn't work, or this one was amazing. And it's important for them to be able to share that in ways that work for them, not necessarily always publicly, right? I only want my sweetheart to know about this, or I only want the members of this community to know about this. And I think the best you can get to is a world that self-heals relatively well. I don't think you get to a world that doesn't make mistakes. I don't think you get to a world where we don't screw things up. But I think you can get to a world where you screw something up and you go, ah! And other people can go, ooh, watch out for that, right?
That sounds a lot like what we're doing right now.
I mean,
screwing it up and then
and steering, but right now, when I hear a lot of folks, I'm listening to the election stuff, and for me, that's all background noise. I think it's background noise for most people, right? I'm trying to build a whole new system. My take on it is not, hey, I'll impose it. My take on it is if this is useful for people, they'll use it. The regulatory stuff emerges as a result of it being useful, right? Why do we use Google? Do we use Google to make sure that they have good ad revenue?
I want them to have all my information, that's why
we use those things. We use those things because they're useful. I'm trying to build. Me and my friends and a bunch of other people that work on this kind of stuff are trying to build these in ways that hopefully don't result in that kind of stalk rather than serve type of structure. Like, we're stalking the users rather than serving those, right? So we're trying to build internet scale infrastructure that's protocols. Like, we don't own it. If you want to participate, you participate, and you're also helping run it, right? It's that kind of stuff. Yeah, over here.
So it sounds like you're talking about building some sort of like reputation-based microstructure. And I'm happy you said the word protocol, because goddamn, we just spend all our time building protocols rather than like private apps. This world would be such a better place already. But that's another.
So here's what we're building. We're building a protocol for protocols.
Cool. Okay. But my question is this. So kind of like the archetypical like thing that came along in the past 10 years that had this reputation-based thing was like Reddit, like Stack Exchange, right? A real simple idea, incredibly useful, changed a lot of stuff, right? So much stuff on Stack Exchange, right? So what do you think like the next step is? Do you think there's an obvious next step?
Yeah. So if you take, I'll take Slack as a communication tool. Thank you guys. Slack as a communication tool. The problem with Slack is the grade point got buried in the string, right? What's cool with Reddit? The grade point gets elevated through phones, basically, right? And then you also have tagging type structures for specific communities, people interested in a particular thing, to be able to focus attention. So you have one coherence layer of attention focus possible. I think that adding additional coherence layers of attention focusing mechanisms is actually where you get to the good stuff. Yeah.
So I'm interested in what you're saying about the currency idea, and I've been thinking like, what is value, and you talk about abundance. That has to be in some form of something that's valuable to someone, or I guess it could be not valuable to someone, but I'm assuming it should be somehow. So currency, like money, we use to represent either work or capital or something like that typically, but there's lots of other forms of value that could be represented as some kind of more advanced currency system. Right, so if we had something that models, let's just say, simply environmental impact as well as work, a measure of work or a measure of resources or something, or transportation or happiness or these kind of things, right? And if you could incorporate that into some kind of multi-dimensional vector of value and use that to form your system, which we're assuming this obviously economy and supply chain or whatever that follows these signals through is efficient, then it might work better.
Yeah, so kind of, yeah. The project is called the Meta Currency Project because there are many forms of currency, right? And we will not invent them. We're trying to create the structure that allows other people to create stuff. And by currency we mean signals. Mm-hmm. And you talk about two types of value there. The way I normally refer to that is value and values, right? And those values can exist at a community-wide level, but usually they actually exist at individual level, and they change over time. This morning I was hungry. I really valued a burrito more than $3. After eating that burrito, I really didn't value a burrito. I valued the $3 more than another burrito, right? And so values shift constantly, and they are different from person to person. And so for me, enabling people to leverage, basically to rely on others to help them shift as their priorities are changing, is kind of the key. And the other piece I'll say, or I started with the election stuff, but I didn't actually get to the point I was trying to make there. With all the election stuff, I hear a lot of people who are angry and are wanting the world to be different. And a lot of what we demand when we're asking for the world to be different is for people to have a voice, and that people will be heard, right? And it's about the ability to send signals. Really, it's about the ability to send signals. That's not enough. It's not enough to be heard so that we can hopefully get somebody to use the stick of violence in the right way. It's better if we can act, right? And when we value something, we can go, yeah, I want to support that. And when we value another thing, we can go, I don't want to support that because they're screwing some other human over in a way that I don't like and I don't appreciate. And not only do I not want to support it, but I want to let other people know that that's a problem. Yeah, go ahead.
So I really love what you talked about in terms of price and especially value. So I'm going to challenge that thought a little bit. Not in today's society, but 2,500 years ago, at the peak of the Roman Empire, about 25% of the population were slaves. And that there was enormous value in that. Wars were waged against other nations to obtain this value. That's why wars were waged. And at some point, there was such a supply glut of slaves that you could purchase someone, a living human, for probably a jug of wine. And that was the value of a human life.
Wine was hard to make at that point.
That's also good. That's also good. Much harder than now.
Ouch.
But
And jugs were hurt.
Jugs were hurt.
So true. But from a sociological standpoint, human beings were not necessarily valued. But if you were a Roman intellectual, you were then valued. So if you could run a household, if you could educate your sons and daughters in Greek philosophy, that was extremely valued. If you were a strapping young lad from a warring nation and you could till the fields, you were then valued as a slave higher than someone who could only say like the dust the floors. If you were a Greek slave and could educate someone's sons and daughters, you were valued higher. So I'm sort of curious as to how we can judge different values, price points, how we can judge abundance. So there was a lot of abundance in terms of slaves, but there was, so when I think of the original question, how much is too much? In that aspect, it's not about the number of people, it's about how do you minimize suffering while doing a net positive in terms of, not necessarily in terms of society, because society was actually doing fairly well. But you have to judge something more than just political success, more than just human, like number success, more than just conquest, because they were also doing very well, but in terms of literally like moral success, moral relativism, something that like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates would bring up in like, what does it mean to be a man, and what does it mean to be a man existing within a city-state?
I'd love to do just a quick rebuttal, not rebuttal, but comment on that, and then I know you had a question or a point. I gave Aristotle a listen last week. I hadn't listened or read any of his stuff, but I was on a long drive, and I was like, I'm going to pull up Aristotle Politics. And it's been a long time since I've listened to this. My worldviews and things have shifted over the years, and I was like, oh my God, this guy's disgusting. and I realized that what I saw, or how I felt about it, was that he had made some fundamental errors in understanding how the world is structured and works, and made some fundamental errors in determining what would be good as a result. And so he goes, slavery is good and hierarchy is good, and all this stuff, right? And the big community is more important than the small individual, and that becomes his worldview because of that. At the same time, this is where the natural ecosystem conversation that happened earlier, hey, is this good? Is that where we want to go to? That was the most useful structure at that time. The community was able to enslave a bunch of folks, could put them into work at the threat of violence, and could go conquer the folks next door who didn't. And do I think slavery is wrong? Fuck yeah! Like, no way is that acceptable behavior. And if I had acted that way at that point, I was probably going to end up enslaved. Right? And so it's really hard for us to broadcast a morality from a context into another context. Not that it makes what they did right, but I think that morality often comes out of, hey, what proves useful? Like when we try things and they turn out to cause real problems for our community, we're like, those are bad, let's not do those anymore. If we try other things and they turn out to be really useful, those are good. It doesn't mean that things are good, it doesn't mean that things that are useful are necessarily good. Rape has been useful in passing on genes for a really long time. Not good, right? So I don't want to confuse that, but Madeline's doing eye contact.
No.
Yes.
Do you remember I told you that someone said to me, "Oh, you have Cossack eyes. That means that your ancestors were raped."
What?
And I was like,
A specific.
I have an ancestral background but my eyes are like basically rapist eyes, according to this very informed person who filled me in on it. So
thank you.
I just know Matt from prior. Matt's one of my friends, and so I was doing this at him to just to try to derail him while he's speaking.
Thank you so much. So yeah, I mean, I think that's so. Is slavery good? No. Was slavery useful at that point? Yeah. Were they able to get? We talked about flows, like new things emerging kind of in an eddy where there are other flows going by. Well, those flows of human slaves are what drove the free time that enabled all the arts and, all that experimenting that those intellectuals did, right? It didn't emerge independent of that. It emerged in part because of that. That sucks. It's also true. Yeah.
So one of the things that you were going back to, you said before about like actions and the roles that individuals can have if they act in better ways when there's better signals communicated to them. But I guess I just worry about the fact that, like, especially how a lot of people live under manufactured scarcity, thinking that I don't really have that much. Like, and this is like the problem. This is the plight of the middle class, right? They really don't have a lot of disposable income. But even though in a relative to the rest of the world, they have so much, just other things. And so it seems to me that like experiencing pain, I don't know how do we make pain empathetic? Because like not all pain some pain to some individuals will make them more selfish, right? And more like I can't help them because I can't even help myself first. So I don't know.
I do think one of my hopes is that with this type of stuff or tools. We will be able to use these things in ways that serve us better. Like one of the things that humans have is heuristics, right? We're better at, we prioritize our short-term interests over our long-term interests. Like we screw up in a variety of ways that were useful at one point in our history, but end up being problematic at other times. If you're able to get signals about not just signals on an intellectual level, but if you get rewarded for doing things that will help you later, you will do those things. So my understanding of how play actually works is we push, this is like flow and dopamine and all that kind of stuff. Basically, you push the boundaries of your skill set a little bit. And in that, your brain rewards you by dumping dopamine and some other neurochemicals in. And you experience an ecstatic emotional state. Your body is literally paying you right now for pushing the boundaries of your skill set, for trying new things, and through trying those new things, establishing some new neural pathways in your head. And later on, after a long period of play, suddenly you can run, you can throw a ball, you can hunt, you can, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So play is a trick that our body plays on us. And I think that we can create other tricks like that we can decide to subscribe to, right? Where we end up making decisions, we end up making decisions that work in our interests, our best interests, over longer terms and over larger communities than we currently are able to.
I have a point regarding the currency and how to evaluate the value. I think I have a question. Actually, I have a thought. Currency is not necessarily about value. It's more about trust and credibility. Because if I say I create this amount of bread and you never know how much they usually put in that. So the currency put in place to have a guarantee of I am credible. And the government is not. So, and when I go further, I think about what's abundance. Like there's nothing such as abundance. It's just a flow of resources. If we think about a lake, so if there are maybe 1 million of fish, and then there are 10 fishermen. So if they tell you that, okay, everyone can only fish 100 fish a day, so that the river can just keep production. However, how do each fisherman know the other guy won't fish 1 million a day? So I think if there is credibility or trust that can kick into place, then there's a flow of resources, and there's nothing as scarcity or abundance. It just keep going, and it's a sense about if you think it's good enough. However, if there's a missing of credibility, then everyone just want to take how much they can get in one shot, and the river just out of fish. And I think that's how people evaluate what they have and what the other people have. And if I think, oh, it's fair, then I'm willing to participate. I think it's good enough for me.
I think to both your points, this is more of a personal anecdote in terms of pain avoidance, and then to the other spectrum, pleasure seeking. So I would say for most of my early childhood, I was motivated by pain avoidance. Grew up very poor. I grew up in mostly lived in a sweatshop for a really long time. So if you've ever been poor, if you've ever been hungry, if you've ever been socially isolated, you never want to feel that again. So you run away from it. So you will, and that is your primary motivation. You're not thinking about pleasure seeking because you don't know what that kind of pleasure is. So I think in that instance, as long as it's not paralyzing, it's extremely useful. But then if I compare myself to my family, for example, we have very different opinions of what abundant is. For my parents who grew up in a remote village in China where they had to pick food from the ground that farmers had already taken, for them abundance is shelter, warmth, and food on the table. For them that's enough. So they're in their late 50s now. They're immeasurably happy because they have a home. When they got to this country, the very thought of welfare was abundance. That's amazing. For me, where I think I was able to experience a much more rapid sort of ascent in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, from basic food and shelter, education, social acceptance, etc., all the way, I don't want to say to the top, but I was able to experience the other side of poverty, which is, I'm not Bill Gates, but much more than 6-year-old Helen would have ever been able to achieve. So luxurious dinners, galas, abundant food on the table, way too much food being wasted, $1,000 a pop plate at some sort of charity event. For me, that was too abundant. That was a waste. That was too much. For someone who has grown up in wealth, that might be a bare minimum. For my brother, who's somewhere in between me and my parents, for him, as long as he has social support, community, that's enough. I need something on top of that. I need intellectual stimulation. I need personal fulfillment. I need that rapid drive for curiosity. Anything beyond that is abundant for me. So when I think someone made the point earlier is that you individually have to set sort of what is abundant and what is not, because even within my family, we've grown up together, we have very different sort of triggers or set points for scarcity and abundance. So I'm sort of curious as to how we can regulate that, not on an individual level, but on a societal level, what is too little and what is too much.
Yeah, so I'll just say this in general. I've been a little confused during the discussion because we kind of vacillate between abundance and determining its measurement at a macro and at a micro level. And micro, I mean as an individual, but just more to your question, speaking more from a macro point of view, I think, and I know a lot of you guys say this, but I'd like to say this for clarification because I was trying to put what everyone's saying together here. So I think for, since, man's existence, we've had different ideologies to determine and how we handle abundance versus not enough and also balance as well. And Matt, was discussing some of them, invisible hand. We got mercantilism, Hayek, Keynesian economics, and then the other part of that. So those are all measurements. But then the other part that we've been talking about are the beliefs, whether at a micro or macro level. So at a macro level, we have all sorts of ideologies. Maoism, Marxism, liberalism, what have you. And then even you guys are talking about stuff at an international relations level. You have realism, liberalism, and then constructivism as well. So what I'm just trying to say is like I think there are drivers for this, and I think the drivers are this movement of people, immigration, ideas, technology, and the other part as well is like control violence, like you were saying, and then disease and death. So I mean, I think if you keep doing this kind of synthesizing people in the same, but I think if you kind of use that as a point of departure, you can like get to some more concrete answers, at least based on what I'm understanding in this conversation. And I'm not saying that I have the answers, because I really don't, So.
Thank you.
Yeah. So many people touched on this already, but just thinking the way the human mind or evolution works affects a lot of our perception of abundance. So, we've evolved to always, because of evolution, we're always seeking more. So it's an inherent natural thing to strive for that. And to try and suppress that seems almost impossible without somehow rewriting our genome or succumbing to giving up on the idea of natural selection. And also in the same way our brains work, we build up models of the world perhaps and perceive things, and we gradually stimuli become normal as they become repeated. So what was like what you're saying there about family members behaving differently, even for one person, can change over time. So they believe they get the first time they get a car or something, they're like, wow, I've moved up the ladder or something. And then after a while, this car's not so great, and now I want a better car, and then they get a better car, and then they want a house, and then they want a family, and a better job, and I don't know, more stuff, and that thing that they were lusting after is suddenly not any good anymore, and it's all because our minds adapt and sort of stimuli reset to normality, I think.
So maybe we're all in just like a permanent equilibrium for each one of ourselves. What drives us, what motivates us, and we always want to strive for something else. So that's when maybe different for everyone else.
But I would say that saying that we're survival of the fittest is a bit simplistic, because I think the other part of this conversation is a discussion on collaboration. So, I mean, humans themselves, they start off as in agrarian communities, okay? It was the beliefs behind that type of collaboration that led to different sorts of confrontations, wherever you might find them, in the world. I think that's really what the core of it is. In my opinion, this is my own philosophy. It's like much of everything we do every day, even the type of work we do, is about how you live. How do you want to live? What do you want to use to live? What do you want to buy to live? What other kind of people do you want to be with? Determine how you live. So I mean, to me, it's really about collaboration. We have violence as ways to defend ourselves, like any other sort of creature. But I don't think that's our main modus operandi. My opinion. So
I want to sort of touch on both those points, and then we can probably wrap up unless there's any other main points. Totally agree that we are built to collaborate. Part of why we are built to collaborate is because collaborating proves to be really useful in competition with others. Right? The name of my company is Collaborative Advantage. I think that if you can improve a community's ability to collaborate, that's the biggest bang for buck that you can get innovation-wise, right? Because it changes their ability to adopt and make use of every new insight that shows up in the community. At the same time, I think that it's not just humans, but lots of other species that are built the way that you just mentioned. there's a huge advantage to, no matter what level you're at, wanting to go a touch further. If you have an animal that's like that, it's constantly building skills, it's constantly learning new things, it's constantly exploring and understanding its territory better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a giant advantage to that. And so the plus side of that is it has babies. The downside of that is that those babies are never going to be consistently satisfied with their life from beginning to end, right? We're kind of built in with some level of dissatisfaction. And from what I understand, that varies from person to person, right? Like people have differences in terms of how happy they feel and all that kind of stuff. But I think that's a pretty big constant.
Well, but I mean, is that sort of comparison a fair comparison even? I wouldn't say necessarily that, humans are going to be, for example, equivalent to a pack of wolves or even chimpanzees.
No,
if
what
I understand it correctly.
What I'm saying is both the humans and the wolves and the chimpanzees are seeking out new and novel experience. They're looking to expand their experience in general. And I like when you think about play, if you play basketball and you're 6 years old and you play basketball with a 6-year-old, this is fascinating because you have similar skills and it stays fascinating because as you get better, they also get better, and so it stays interesting. If as you're 35 years old, you play basketball with a 6-year-old, it might be interesting because it's your 6-year-old, but you're not like, oh wow, right? You're not into the game in the same way because it's not a challenge in the same way that it would be if you were playing with a 35-year-old who was a similar skill level. And the long story short there is I buy into that argument. It doesn't mean it's right, but I buy into we are built to want to push where we're at. And not that we don't ever feel satisfied, we do, but it's not like the standard state that we experience throughout all of life.
I have a point on this. I read a book about wolves. So about how wolves survive in Mongolia, for example. And they talk about there's a wolf, the leader of the wolf versus a crowd of wolves. They talk about the leader of wolf not necessarily is the strongest, but he sort of know a lot about strategy and how to create the equilibrium. Like they keep moving, however they create equilibrium. So my thought is, in the individual level, yes, we always try to have as much success as possible, or we want to be all over the place. However, in a group that collectively, there's always a thing we hit, like the sexual STD. Like there are things that collectively would make us bounce back. And I think for species who can survive for such a long time, not necessarily they are strongest, but in the group collectively, they have a check and balance to create an equilibrium. So that makes one person always want to be really aggressive. The other person might be more supporting. So I think that's how I see and how to incorporate.
I'll just throw this out here just for sake of discussion. So if we take if we're looking from objectively, like game theory, Nash equilibrium, or even prisoner's dilemma, then we see cooperation, collaboration is actually being beneficial. I think really the question comes down to is intention. Even at a group level, what's your intention? Encountering with this other group, how are you going to communicate with them? Are you going to be a bunch of pilgrims and wipe out the natives, or what, man? Or are you going to let's embrace the natives because they just gave us Thanksgiving?
Or embrace them with special blankets.
Yeah, it's just.
Whoa, that's a terrible reference. That's an awful reference.
But anyway, I think it comes down to intention, what your motivations are. Intention then, begets what are your beliefs, driving your intentions. So.
I think we're pretty much out of time, but thank you so much.
Thank you. One thing I love to ask people is
things that you've read that are relevant to this, or things that pop up later, just post them in the event page for people. It's a really nice way of like keeping the conversation going a little bit.
Yeah, I was curious about the name of that book you mentioned, that Seeing Nature.
That's right, Seeing Nature by Paul Kraffel.
Okay.
And there's actually a video online that he self-produced with, I think, the help of some students. It's awful, awful production value. But that's called Upward Spiral, or the Upward Spiral. There's a long version where the first 10 minutes will be pretty unbearable to watch. And then there's a shorter version that a friend of mine edited. And yeah, I highly recommend that. There's another book too called Panarchy, which was written by a group of ecologists. And I first read that last fall, and when I read it, I was like, yes, this is exactly where I've come to in my understanding of how these things work. I don't think they use the word coherence layer, but they basically map out the life cycle of an ecosystem, or of a coherence layer, as it sort of finds its footing, matures, and collapses, and kind of what the process looks like, and how that affects adjacent, they refer to it as adjacent layers or ecosystems, but I think of it as adjacent coherence layers. Panarchy, it's a bunch of different chapters, each one's on a different sort of topic. It's much more academic than Seeing Nature, which is just this beautiful, quiet book about a guy who walked around in nature and what he saw over a lifetime of walking around in nature. But Panarchy is really good from a, like, yep, I see that in the business world, I see that in, you know, the forest, I see it in any complex adaptive system. It kind of takes this sort of path. And they have I'm doing this symbol with my hand because they actually have a shape of the process that they're describing. It's on the cover. It looks like a tilted figure 8, but yeah, Panarchy.
I was going to mention two books, Cradle to Cradle. I forget, it's kind of a famous book about closed-loop systems. And there's another book by a British psychoanalyst named Adam Phillips called Maps to Happiness. And he's a pretty amazing writer, but he also talks about how the human mind is really more interested in suffering than happiness, which is kind of an interesting conundrum.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.